Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Jeffrey Epstein Show. I'm your host, Bobbycapucci, and this is a morning update. We're going to head back down to the Virgin Islands, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the seesaw battle that is underway for Jeffrey Epstein's estate within the court system of the Virgin Islands right now. The players, we all know who the players are. We know about Indike, we know about Khan, and we know about the Attorney General, Denise George. Now, my gut tells me that Denise George is looking to enhance her profile for a future run within the political structure of the Virgin Islands or perhaps elsewhere. So this case is very important for her profile. Now, I've been on record here on the podcast saying that I am completely 100% against Denise George and the Virgin Islands setting themselves up as victims in this case, whereas they get a cash payment when the settlement is dispersed. That's a non-starter for me. It should be a non-starter for everyone, considering the Virgin Islands and her colleagues and predecessors were all getting their palms greased by Jeffrey Epstein. They were all turning their heads the other way while Epstein was conducting his reign of terror. And now they think that they should be getting money on the backside when there's a settlement? It's atrocious. It's disgusting, and it stinks to high heaven. So if she is going to go about it that way, then Denise George obviously is just another person who is looking to use the backs of the survivors to climb up the chain of personal gain. And I will never sit back quietly and watch something like that occur. That's something that I will definitely talk about here on the podcast, and it's something that should be talked about in every corner of every bit of this investigation because it's gross. Now, with that said, if somehow Denise George finds a way to focus on what's important in this case and focus on the actual survivors and bringing Jeffrey Epstein's organization to justice, then she'll really be setting herself up for a profile that will do her a lot of favors moving forward. And believe me, I'm not saying that she shouldn't try and have some upward mobility in her life and in her career. That's the whole goal, right? When you get a job, most of us, we want to do a good job so we get promoted, so we get more money, better benefits, whatever it may be. And Denise George, she's a human being, and it's no different for her, right? But her motivations need to be more genuine. And if her motivations are strictly focused on justice and the survivors in this case, that profile that she's trying to build will shoot into the stratosphere. Just take a look at what happened with Rudy Giuliani after he went after the mafia and crushed them with RICO. Just look at his profile. And I'm not talking about now or anything like that. I'm talking about directly after the trial, after Rudolph Giuliani helped pretty much destroy the mafia. Look at what his profile did. Look at how it shot up into the stratosphere. And the same thing can be true for Denise George here. If she does the right thing, if she backs off the request of adding the Virgin Islands as a survivor and as somebody who should get some money in this case, if she backs away from that and she focuses on just going after justice and slapping these people with a RICO charge, she could go down as one of the biggest heroes in the history of any attorney general, any prosecutor that has went after or goes after human traffickers. Because that's the level of Jeffrey Epstein's operation, folks. It's at the top of the heap. It was operating at the most powerful levels around the world. We're not talking about in one state. We're not talking about in two states. We're not talking about in one country. We're talking about multiple continents and multiple power players being involved. If Denise George just focuses on that and she leads the charge here for a RICO case, she will come out of this as a hero. Unfortunately, from the precedent set in the past by these prosecutors, by these bureaucrats, by these so-called officials who are supposed to bring justice to the perpetrators, well, we can't really trust that that's going to be the case. So we're going to follow this very closely. We're going to try and give Denise George the benefit of the doubt when we can, but we're also going to be very critical of any move that has her hand in the cookie jar, taking money away from these girls who had lived with this abuse, who had suffered through this abuse, and who still currently carry all of the weight on their shoulders from what happened to them. Those are the survivors, Denise George. Those are the people who deserve money, not the Virgin Islands. Get it together. So today, our article is from the New York Times, and the headline is, Attorney General Sees Too Much Secrecy in the Epstein Case. And the article was published by Matthew Goldstein and Steve Eder. The top prosecutor in the U.S. Virgin Islands says the estate needs to provide more details about Jeffrey Epstein's finances and is insisting on clauses that could protect others from wrongdoing. Yeah, look, this is all important stuff. We've talked about this stuff at length here on the podcast. I am documented about how I feel about any sort of deal that provides protection for other people who are involved in this is a non-starter. If I was the lawyer, it would be a non-starter. And I'm pretty confident for at least some of these survivors that they'll never acquiesce to those sort of requests. They'll never, ever give up their rights. And they'll never, ever, ever choose to be victimized once again by the Epstein estate, because that's the way Indike and Khan are moving, right? They're trying to do whatever they can to make sure the estate comes out with smelling like roses, because Indike and Khan want to get paid. They want to make sure all of their finances are covered, right? So if it's up to them, they'll dole out the least amount of money possible within this estate ruling. So it's good that Denise George is all over these guys, right? Again, we have to be fair. We have to give credit when it's due. And I can dislike one aspect of the way Denise George handles this case while liking another aspect, right? That's just how it works in life sometimes. You don't agree with everything somebody does. And that's okay. We're not meant to agree with each other all the time. And we're not meant to just, fall in line and follow suit, right? We all have different opinions about all sorts of topics. And for me, I think that Denise George, the way that she's pursuing these guys is a good avenue and aggressive, but at the same time, I would really like her to shake off the stink of looking like a money grabber, because if she does that, she will really position herself to be a titan in this case. Some of the same furtive techniques that Jeffrey Epstein employed in life are showing up in the litigation over dividing up the wealth he left behind when he died. There are mysterious companies, lingering non-disclosure agreements, and contractual clauses that some lawyers fear could protect anyone who took part in Mr. Epstein's wrongdoing. Look, this was not a normal trafficking ring, folks. This was not your typical human trafficking ring, okay? This was a criminal enterprise that was not only engaged in human trafficking and the abuse of young girls, but they were engaged in all sorts of crazy-ass money laundering. All kinds of crazy money laundering. And that is the backbone for most of these RICO cases that you see that get slapped on these people. It is the backbone. Now, you see it right here in the first couple of paragraphs of the article, that Jeffrey Epstein had his money tied up in all kinds of knots, had it dispersed in all sorts of accounts, had all kinds of different ways to protect that money. Now, do you think he was able to accomplish that on his own? Do you think that Jeffrey Epstein was able to move that amount of units on his own? Without Title 31 being involved, without him getting sarked, anything like that? Come on, zero chance. So, there were other people that were involved in the financial aspects of this organization, other people that were involved in the money laundering aspects of this organization, and yet, still no indictments. There are mysterious the estate's lawyers say they have a plan to fairly distribute money to dozens of women who have accused Mr. Epstein of sexually abusing them as teenagers. But the Attorney General of the U.S. Virgin Islands, where Mr. Epstein built a complex web of corporate entities, says Mr. Epstein's money is still buying silence. Yeah, we know that. Look, it's just because Epstein is gone does not mean the remnants of the organization aren't still in play. Now, I'm not saying that they're still active as far as human trafficking when it comes to the Epstein portion of this organization, but they're definitely still active behind the scenes. What about all of the other players that aren't dead? You think that they aren't cajoling behind the scenes and they're not trying to set themselves up so that they're insulated from all of this? And again, it goes back to the Elain Maxwell comments from The Sun. It's very important that we always bring that up because she was not hacked. None of that stuff occurred, in my opinion. Those were all shots across the bow, so Indike and Khan knew who the power player still was, so that they knew that if they stepped on her toes, there was going to be a reaction, and it was not going to be good for them or perhaps other co-conspirators. And in the middle is a fortune estimated at well over $500 million. We have a lot of concerns with respect to the transparency of the estate and its finances and the accounting of the estate, the Attorney General, Denise George, said in an interview last month. Yeah, look, we talked about that. We talked about the interview. We covered that interview here on the podcast, and we went through the article. And again, I'm neutral on Denise George, folks. I really am neutral on her. It can go either way at this point. I'm willing to give her the benefit of the doubt as far as it goes. If it gets to the point where she's really, really trying to get this money for the Virgin Islands, then she just becomes another scuzzbag within this case who is trying to steal from the survivors, basically. And I don't think it's acceptable for anyone to have their fingers in this pie, considering what these survivors have went through. Ms. George filed a civil forfeiture lawsuit against the estate in January, roughly 5 months after Mr. Epstein committed suicide, allegedly, while being held in federal custody in Manhattan after his arrest on sex trafficking charges. She said she sued to protect the interests of Mr. Epstein's accusers and recoup some of the money that Mr. Epstein made during his 2 decades in the Virgin Islands. And there's the rub. Again, what do I always tell you about reading between the lines, folks? And right there, the last sentence is where you need to read between the lines. She said she sued to protect the interests of Mr. Epstein's accusers and recoup some of the money that Mr. Epstein made during his 2 decades in the Virgin Islands. So, again, pointing out that she's trying to get money for the Virgin Islands as an entity. That dog does not hunt, all right? That is a non-starter for me. It's unacceptable, and I will criticize that and call it out until the very end of days. It's disgusting on its face, Miss George. Please change course. The estate has insisted it's acting in the best interest of Mr. Epstein's accusers, but it has also provided an incomplete accounting of his finances according to records reviewed by the New York Times. Of course it has. How can it provide a true accounting of the records when we're talking about an organization that's involved in money laundering that is so deep and pervasive that without a team of forensic accountants, you'll never be able to unwrap that knot? And yet, have we heard from any forensic accountants? Have we heard from anybody that's working the case that comes out and says, look, we have this angle covered. Don't worry, we're all over this. No. All we get is Berman with useless platitudes and the calling out of Prince Andrew, when in reality, there are many co-conspirators that are here in the United States already, and there has been no movement to round any of them up. At least one business, IGO Company, LLC, a corporate entity established by Mr. Epstein in December 2006, was left out of the estate's court filings. The company, which lists Mr. Epstein as its sole owner, was still active and in good standing as of Monday, according to a U.S. Virgin Islands government site. And again, do you think that happened in a vacuum down there? Do you think Jeffrey Epstein just showed up for a business license like me or you would, or to establish a company, and it was just there was a problem for him? No, of course not. He showed up. Whoever the person was in charge of making sure it happens probably had their palms greased. I don't have any evidence of that, but that's the MO. That's the blueprint we've seen. So Epstein went down there, did his thing, greased a few palms, and now you have the Virgin Islands and Denise George trying to situate themselves as a victim. I'm sorry, Denise George, but a victim, more like accomplices, all right? The Virgin Islands should be on the hook. They should have to pay some of these survivors some money too for everybody turning their head the other way. Is that an avenue that we should start to discuss and start to search for? Because Miss George, if you keep up your press for some money here, well, perhaps the tables must be flipped on you, and maybe the Virgin Islands should be named in the lawsuit as an enabler. You know, it can go many ways, folks. There are a lot of twists and turns in cases like this, as we have all experienced so far. Lawyers for the estate did not respond to a request for comment. The co-executors of the estate are Darren Indyke, a lawyer, and Richard Kahn, an accountant. Both men worked closely with Mr. Epstein for many years and were listed as officers for some of his businesses. We've talked about that at length as well. Indyke was connected to Epstein at the hip. He was his in-house lawyer, his confidant, and somebody that had his signature all across Epstein's empire. So, again, remember that when we're talking about this estate and we're talking about these funds being distributed to these survivors, remember who these people are that we're dealing with. Much of the fighting between the estate and Miss George's office involves a plan to establish a victims' compensation fund which would allow accusers to receive payments from the estate without a potentially costly court case. The estate's representatives say the proposed fund, which would be set up with the help of the specialists who ran the compensation program for victims of the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, would allow accusers to receive money quickly and privately. And again, you know, I'm on record here saying that it's not my place to tell any of these survivors how to move forward. Not my place at all. I'm not the one that lives with their burden. I'm not the one that lives with their financial responsibilities, any of that. So whichever one of these survivors decides to go this route, that's on them. That's their decision, and they know what's best for them, and their counsel knows what's best for them, and it's not for anyone else to judge how someone pursues compensation here. My biggest gripe, and when I talk about this, is the estate and how they try and make it draconian for these girls. And it's been like that forever. So I think there is good reason for concern by Denise George and anybody following the case that the estate would follow suit here and again try and victimize the survivors on the back end. So that's why I'm very critical about things that are going on here and why I'm always very cautious and keep a very close eye on the way things are moving in regards to the estate and the settlement. Because you know when it comes to money, people are shiesty as hell. So like usual, like I say, like we know to do here on the podcast for sure, follow the money. But Miss George said the estate wanted to attach too many strings to those payments. On April 7th, Miss George's office told the probate court handling Mr. Epstein's will that she and the estate had reached an impasse over the estate's demand that victims who take part in the fund agree to a broad release that would bar them from suing any party, whether they participated negligently or intentionally in wrongdoing themselves. Absolutely not. Zero chance as a lawyer that I would be okay with that. There is no way that I would let my client sign over their story and again be victimized a second time by silence. There's zero chance I would ever let that occur. And if I was the court, I would strike that down. I would tell the estate, if I was the judge, I would tell the estate, this is a non-starter for me. You're not going to silence these girls again. You've silenced them for decades in some cases. These girls are going to be able to tell their stories, and you are going to administer those funds. It's not that difficult. Are there no judges left in the system that are willing to stand up to the federal government and to powerful people like Indyke and Kahn and Epstein's estate? I mean, the only one that comes to mind is Emmett G. Sullivan, and Mr. Sullivan would never stand for anything like this in his courtroom. I promise you that. I promise you that. So my question is, are there any heroes left within the justice system? And if so, are any of them going to step up and do the right thing? To Miss George, the estate's conduct was a reminder of the legal maneuvers that surrounded Mr. Epstein's guilty plea 12 years ago to soliciting prostitution from a minor in Florida. Again, a minor cannot be a prostitute. Every single time I see this in print, I'm going to have to correct it because it disgusts me. In 2007, federal prosecutors agreed to a wide-ranging non-prosecution agreement that covered Mr. Epstein's named and unnamed co-conspirators. A federal appeals court this month rejected a legal challenge brought by one of his survivors to the agreement. And again, it wasn't the full court impaneled. It was 3 judges. One, a 90-year-old man, another, a Harvard graduate, and the third, a woman. And the third judge on the panel, Judge Hull, gave a scathing dissent of the ruling by the other 2 judges. So when the whole entire circuit is impaneled, they're definitely going to see this again, and the impassioned dissent by Judge Hull is going to be the thing that seals it. Because the rest of the 11th Circuit Court is going to take a look at that, and they're going to have to render a judgment as the full circuit, as opposed to just the 3 judges taking a preliminary look. Ms. George's office said the estate now wanted to secure similar broad protection for Epstein's compatriots in crime from their survivors. Lawyers for the estate reject that argument. In their response, they said Ms. George had mischaracterized the situation and said 2 lawyers representing several accusers were ready to move forward with the fund. Well, that's okay. Then that's between them and their clients. If the lawyers for the girls who are ready to move forward with the fund have come to the conclusion that it's time for their clients to get paid, and they're willing to move forward and end this saga of their lives, then that's fine. That should definitely be something that is available to them. But it has to be administered fairly. It has to be administered in the correct way. And these lawyers that push their clients toward this, they better not just be looking for a payday. Because if they are, they're going to be absolutely eviscerated. Its intent, they say, is to make sure a victim does not double dip by getting compensation from the fund and then suing an individual affiliated with the estate who might be entitled to be legally reimbursed by the estate. Well, that doesn't even make any sense. Again, it's more legalese loophole bullshit. All right? Let me tell you something. If Jeffrey Epstein abused you, and then some of his friends abused you, and the co-conspirators were involved, you should be able to have a suit against all of these people. Just because they work for Epstein's estate, they're all protected? Nah, sorry, that does not work for me. And it shouldn't work for anybody. It's egregious, and it's a miscarriage of justice. The particulars of how Mr. Epstein made his millions have long been a mystery, in particular after his 2008 conviction. Financial filings the estate has made so far have raised as many questions as they have answered. In January, the estate filed a required report that, along with routine transactions to pay bills and other expenses, showed the estate had transferred more than $12 million to Southern Country International, a little-known private bank Mr. Epstein had established in 2014. Again, there are so many money crimes happening right here, up front and in the light of day, that'll make your head spin. How in the world has this guy not been caught for Title 31? How in the world has that not occurred? The magistrate judge overseeing the probate of the will, Carolyn Herman Purcell, questioned the estate's lawyers about the transfers and asked for a fuller accounting. The estate has not yet filed an explanation. The territory's courts have granted blanket extensions because of the coronavirus outbreak. Oh, I'm so tired of it. I'm so tired of them using the pandemic as an excuse, as another way to punt the ball, as another way to drag their feet. We have teleconferencing. All right? There's no reason for proceedings to stall because of the coronavirus when we have the technology that we have. Let's get things moving. Let's get a resolution here, folks. But according to 4 people familiar with the matter, the estate's $12 million payment to the bank involved preparations for Mr. Epstein's criminal case. Mr. Epstein used the bank to pay a $12 million retainer fee to the criminal defense attorney, Reed Weingarten, according to the people who spoke on the condition of anonymity because the matter has not been made public. Well, that's nice. Even in death, Jeffrey Epstein's moving a cool $12 million as a retainer fee for some lawyer. You don't think that $12 million would be better off in the hands of the survivors. It's just another way for these dudes to bleed the estate, to take money out of the pockets of the survivors. It's obvious what they're doing. It is obvious what they're doing, but the legacy media is too busy nitpicking and calling people conspiracy theorists to do their job. In mid-December, Mr. Weingarten's law firm, Steptoe Johnson, returned the unused portion of that retainer, roughly $11 million, according to the estate's first quarterly filing. The next day, the estate sent that money to the bank. Why? Why would they send it to that bank? Okay, put it in the trust, whatever you're going to do. Stop trying to play games, Indike. You know, for me, in my opinion, this is a Darren Indike move, signed, sealed, and delivered and stamped. This is the sort of shit this guy does. He really disgusts me. What happened to the money in Southern Country after that is not clear. The estate reported the bank had a year-end balance of just $500,000. Southern Country is an unusual kind of bank, an international banking entity which is limited to conducting business for customers overseas. Mr. Epstein was approved for his license in 2014, but the bank had not commenced doing business as of April 2018, according to a letter the bank sent to its regulator. I mean, come on. You're telling me this isn't a laundering operation? This isn't used to, wash money, stash money, whatever it may be? I'm not a forensic accountant, but come on. All right? You don't have enough money to jump into a RICO case here with just the stuff we have on its face? I mean, come on. It's a joke. It's an absolute joke, folks. In recent weeks, Mrs. George's office sent a subpoena seeking bank records for Mr. Epstein's businesses in the Virgin Islands, according to two people briefed on that matter. She also subpoenaed some records from the Virgin Islands Economic Development Authority, the government agency that granted lucrative tax benefits to Mr. Epstein's companies, said Tracy Bola, an authority lawyer. All right, well, that's interesting, right? If that's the case, are you going to hold the people that gave Epstein these sweetheart deals responsible within the Virgin Islands? Until you do that, how can you ever try and set the Virgin Islands up as a victim in this case? You can't. You cannot do it. You have to clean up your own backyard before you start yelling about your neighbors. According to one person familiar with the matter, Miss George's office has also made a demand for information from Mr. Epstein's former girlfriend and business associate, co-conspirator, Elain Maxwell, who recently filed a lawsuit against the estate asking it to cover her legal fees for any claims brought against her by his accusers. So, basically, I think she screws herself with this request. What she's doing is she's obviously tying herself to the estate. So if and when a RICO charge comes and a RICO case is brought to the forefront, they can slap her right away and use this as evidence. Look, she's admitting she's part of the organization. She wants the estate to defend her. I mean, come on. It's so... The blueprint is there. The template is there. All that's missing is the will from the federal government. Miss George's office has also reached out to some of Mr. Epstein's former employees in the Virgin Islands. She said her office was trying to navigate around nondisclosure agreements that Mr. Epstein had signed with many of them. She said the estate should commit to releasing the employers from those agreements. I agree. Or maybe the court should step in and squash those agreements, because this is absurd. This is absolutely absurd that people that had firsthand knowledge can't even be spoken to because there's an NDA. And another thing, you want to get rid of the NDA? Slap everybody who has one with a RICO charge. The government loves to do it, so why aren't they doing it right now? They get RICO happy when it comes to going into South Central and busting a crack dealer. Oh, they love to do that. Oh, they pull you over, you got a little bit of blow in your car, you're a drug dealer, we're seizing everything you own, your mom lives in the house, I don't care, we're taking it. But when it comes to Jeffrey Epstein and his rich buddies, oh, no, we have NDAs, we can't speak to you. Imagine trying that shit. These dudes raid your house, you're part of a criminal organization, and John Gotti's your boss, and they go to arrest you, and they're trying to talk to you, and you're like, whoa, I signed a non-disclosure agreement, I can't talk to you. How do you think the feds would react to that? So why do they react differently when it comes to Epstein and his cohorts? Just the existence of an NDA casts a shadow or chilling effect on anyone speaking freely, she said. While many of Mr. Epstein's companies, including IGO Company, LLC, continue to exist on paper, there is little left of their physical operations. Those include Southern Trust, once Mr. Epstein's main business venture, which generated $300 million in profits in just 6 years. Mr. Epstein has said it was a DNA research firm, although Ms. George said her office had found no evidence it engaged in that kind of work. Southern Trust is valued at $234 million, and the estate has yet to disclose where most of its assets are being held. Of course they haven't, because they're all being laundered. They're probably being washed in a car wash by Walter White and Skyler right now. I mean, are you kidding me? For months after his death, employees still showed up at the company's office in the American Yacht Harbor Club on St. Thomas. That stopped in late February. And by the start of last month, the office doors were secured with a padlock. Well, that's good. I've said that from the beginning. I don't want any of these properties to have any sort of workers on the grounds bleeding money. I want $0 to be spent from this estate besides anything that is essential in facilitating these girls being paid. Point blank, period. Anything else is basically stealing from the survivors at this point. We got ourselves a situation here in the Virgin Islands, folks, and Jeffrey Epstein did this on purpose. He set up his estate down there on purpose, and now we will see, when the rubber meets the road, if Denise George is going to become a hero or if she is just going to go down as another villain in the Jeffrey Epstein Chronicles. If you'd like to contact me, you could do that at bobbycapucci@protonmail.com. That's BOBBYCAPUCCI@protonmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter at BOBBY_CAPUCCI. All right, everybody, I hope you all have a fantastic day, and I will be back later tonight for a little bit more conversation.